The clock on the wall ticked faintly, marking 9 a.m. sharp in the waiting area of Bright Edge Corporation's headquarters in Seattle. A man in his mid-40s adjusted his tie. His name was Malcolm Ross, well-dressed, poised, and carrying a portfolio that seemed to hold decades of experience. Yet his calm exterior betrayed none of the thoughts running through his mind. Malcolm wasn't just another job seeker. What no one in the office knew was that he was the CEO of Bright Edge, incognito on a mission to assess his company's hiring practices. After hearing whispers of discrimination in the recruitment process, Malcolm decided to see for himself. Today's interview would be different, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The door to the interview room opened. A woman in a crisp gray suit stood there, clipboard in hand. Her nameplate read, Miss Richardson, hiring manager. With a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she gestured for Malcolm to enter. Mr. Ross, correct? She asked, extending her hand briefly before retreating to her seat. Her tone was polite but clipped, as though she'd already made up her mind. Malcolm responded with a warm, yes, thank you for having me. He sat across from her, placing his portfolio neatly on the table. The conversation began smoothly, questions about his resume, his previous leadership roles, and his experience managing high-profile projects. Malcolm answered with measured confidence, laying out examples of his work in revitalizing struggling companies. Yet as he spoke, he noticed something. Miss Richardson's eyes flickered with skepticism, and her responses became increasingly curt. By the time they reached the technical portion of the interview, the atmosphere had grown tense. Miss Richardson's tone shifted. Her words edged with passive-aggressive remarks disguised as casual banter. Impressive. But I have to wonder if this level of leadership might be a bit ambitious for someone with your background, she said, her smile thin and insincere. Malcolm paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe strong leadership comes from diverse experiences and the ability to adapt, qualities I've demonstrated consistently over my career. She nodded, scribbling something on her clipboard, but her next question veered off course. Do you think you'd be able to fit into our culture here? It's unique. We're a fast-paced, competitive team, and our clients have very high standards. Malcolm understood the undertone. He smiled politely, but felt the subtle sting of the implication. Still, he didn't let it show. But what she said next would leave a mark. Miss Richardson leaned back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers. Her tone was cool, casual, too casual. You've certainly had an interesting career path, she said, her words slow and deliberate. But I'm not sure if it aligns with the direction we're heading as a company. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, as though seeking clarification. I'd be happy to hear more about what you mean. My goal is to bring value to the team, no matter the environment. She chuckled lightly. The sound hollow. It's not about value. Really, it's about synergy. Sometimes even the most qualified candidates don't quite fit the vision we have. Her words hung in the air, and Malcolm could feel their weight. He could see it in her eyes, the subtle bias she tried so hard to cloak behind professionalism. It wasn't about his qualifications. It wasn't about his vision. It was about him, and she was making it abundantly clear. She closed the folder containing his resume and smiled, a tight, dismissive gesture. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Ross. We'll be in touch if we decide to move forward. There it was, the kind of rejection that didn't need further explanation. But Malcolm didn't stand up right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. I appreciate your time, Miss Richardson, he said, his voice steady. I'm curious, though, if qualifications and vision aren't what you're looking for. What is? For a brief moment, her mask slipped, the smile faltered, and her eyes darted away before she quickly regained her composure. As I said, it's about synergy, she repeated, her tone sharper this time. We're looking for someone who fits the mold. Malcolm nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I see. Thank you for clarifying. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand. She hesitated before shaking it, her grip limp. As he turned to leave, he glanced back briefly, It's always insightful to see how companies define their mold. With that, he walked out, his steps measured, his mind already racing. But what Miss Richardson didn't realize was that this interview was far from over. Malcolm walked down the hallway, passing rows of polished glass offices and bustling employees. His face betrayed no emotion, but inside, he was calculating his next move. The sting of Miss Richardson's thinly veiled bias was fresh, but it wasn't unexpected. It was, after all, the very reason he was here today. Instead of heading to the exit, Malcolm took a sharp turn toward the elevator. The sleek silver doors reflected his composed expression as he pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator ascended, he adjusted his tie once more, the faintest hint of a smirk appearing on his face. The doors opened to the executive suite, a floor adorned with modern decor, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an unmistakable air of authority. Malcolm's assistant, a sharp-eyed young man named Anthony, greeted him immediately. "Mr. Ross," Anthony said with a knowing glance, "the team is ready for you in the boardroom." Malcolm nodded. "Good. Let's not keep them waiting." He strode into the boardroom, where the company's senior leadership sat in anticipation. They rose when he entered, their demeanor shifting to one of respect and formality. Malcolm took his seat at the head of the table, placing his portfolio in front of him. "Before we begin today's agenda," Malcolm started, his voice calm but firm, "I want to share an experience I just had in one of our hiring processes." The room fell silent. The executives exchanged curious glances, unsure of where this was going. "I just came from an interview with one of our hiring managers," he continued. "Miss Richardson." A murmur rippled through the room. Malcolm raised a hand, silencing them. It was enlightening, to say the least. "I posed as a candidate, bringing my qualifications and experience to the table. And despite exceeding the requirements for the role, I was dismissed, not for my abilities, but for reasons that had nothing to do with the job." The air in the room grew heavy as the implications of his words sank in. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I've heard whispers of bias in our hiring practices," Malcolm said, his tone now sharper. "But whispers aren't enough. I needed to see it firsthand, and now I have." Anthony stepped forward, handing out copies of Malcolm's notes on the interview. The room was still as each executive began to read. "What's even more troubling," Malcolm continued, "is that this isn't just a reflection of Miss Richardson's judgment. It's a reflection of the culture we've allowed to persist within this company." His words hung in the air like a weight no one could escape. But this confrontation wasn't over. Malcolm had one more move to make. The boardroom remained silent as the executives read Malcolm's notes. Some exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from discomfort to concern. Finally, Howard Green, the chief operating officer, broke the silence. "Malcolm, are you certain this was about bias? Miss Richardson has been with the company for over a decade. She's one of our most seasoned managers." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "Howard, I've built my career on reading between the lines." Her words were calculated, her tone dismissive, and her reasoning vague. "And let's not pretend this is an isolated incident. We've all seen the patterns: who gets promoted, who gets hired, and who gets overlooked." Howard opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by Malcolm's raised hand. "This isn't up for debate. This is a wake-up call. And I'm not here to vilify one person. I'm here to fix what's broken." At that moment, the boardroom doors opened, and Miss Richardson stepped in. Her face was a mix of confusion and unease. She had been summoned but didn't know why. Her eyes widened slightly as she saw Malcolm seated at the head of the table, his presence now unmistakably authoritative. "Miss Richardson," Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. "Please take a seat." She hesitated, glancing around the room before complying. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone cautious. "You tell me," Malcolm replied. "This morning, I interviewed with you as a prospective candidate. Do you remember?" Her face froze for a split second before she forced a polite smile. "Of course, Mr. Ross, wasn't it?" "That's correct," Malcolm said. "But what you didn't realize is that I'm also Malcolm Ross, the CEO of this company." Her expression faltered, and the room seemed to shrink around her. She opened her mouth to speak, but Malcolm continued before she could find her words. "I want you to explain to this room why you dismissed me as a candidate," he said, his tone even but commanding. "Let's start with your comment about synergy. What exactly did you mean by that?" Miss Richardson's eyes darted to Howard, searching for support, but his expression was unreadable. I was referring to the team dynamic," she stammered. "I didn't think you would fit." "And what led you to that conclusion?" Malcolm pressed. "Because my qualifications were above and beyond what the role required. Or was it something else?" The tension in the room was palpable. Miss Richardson's voice wavered as she attempted to respond. I never intended to discriminate." Malcolm interjected, his voice sharper now. "Intention doesn't matter. What matters is the impact. And the impact of your decisions ripples far beyond one interview." Miss Richardson looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of her actions and the scrutiny of the room were too much to bear. In the weeks that followed, Bright Edge underwent a profound transformation. The new initiatives Malcolm implemented began to take root: third-party oversight for hiring, mandatory bias training, and transparent evaluation processes. Miss Richardson, though shaken, chose to stay and confront her biases head-on. She became an advocate for fair hiring practices, earning back the trust of her colleagues over time. Malcolm's bold actions resonated beyond Bright Edge's walls, sparking similar changes in other companies. The story of a CEO going undercover to expose bias became a beacon of hope, a reminder that change begins with accountability and leadership. And for Bright Edge, the culture began to shift, a slow but meaningful journey toward fairness and inclusivity, proving that the courage to confront uncomfortable truths can lead to a better future for all.